Good morning, I'm John Jannarone, Editor-in-Chief of CorpGov. Very happy to be back in New York City at Nasdaq MarketSite. I have with me here today Marc Drechsler, who is EVP of Corporate Affairs at the Weber Shandwick Collective. Marc, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
And by the way, Marc, it's great to see you again. We met actually in New Orleans just a few weeks ago at another corporate governance-focused event. It was the Tulane conference. So let's dig right into it. Let's talk about M&A transactions. So you have some interesting data indicating that 70% of deals don't meet expectations. So there are a number of things that can go wrong. There could be financial considerations, but I think what you might want to talk about is cultural issues, right?
Exactly. Well, the stat that 70% of deals oftentimes do not live up to their expectations, I think is really not a new data point, right? What is more new and more novel is if you manage the human aspect of deals, that actually gives you a chance to be more successful in how you execute these deals. Oftentimes up to 8 times.
Yeah.
And how you manage through the human centricity is something that a lot of our clients are asking us for, and it's kind of a new way to execute a playbook on M&A these days.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, having started out my career in investment banking, you don't think about culture when you're building a model for a deal. I mean, how do you start, how do you use any numbers, or how do you apply any rigor to something like that?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a couple of things, right? One thing is definitely listening to your stakeholders.
Yeah.
And I think today we have a lot more tools to look into the stakeholders and how they actually communicate, where they are, the channels that they use. So it's like a multi-stakeholder approach. That's number one. I think number two is you really have to think through, how do you execute the playbook in this multi-stakeholder world? Against all the different expectations where your stakeholders are, right? Again, that human centricity. We are dealing with human beings, right, that are all affected in these deals. And oftentimes I always make that example, right? You don't wake up as a stakeholder per se, right? You oftentimes you can be a customer, you can be a shareholder at the same time, and you can be an employee, right? So looking into all of that, and especially listening to your employees is one tactic, but we can go into much more of that.
Yeah, I really like that, Marc. I mean, you're right. There are so many stakeholders involved in any of these situations, and I think that a lot of people forget about some of them who are very important. We'll talk more about those in a bit. Let's talk about communicating M&A deals. So this is an interesting question, a journalist talking to a communications expert here.
Yeah.
Back in the day when I was doing more of this, I was trying to get sources and break the news before the company ever told me about it. In rare cases, if you were very lucky, the company would cooperate with you and kind of give you the story. Tell me about how things have changed over the last couple decades.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you asked this question because in a lot of ways, right, if you dial back time 20 years ago, right, the deals, how they were announced, that template really hasn't changed that much, unfortunately, right? So today, of course, the way that you as a stakeholder or human being, right, perceive a deal, right, it's a totally different experience from what you had 20 years ago. But you still have to focus on the announcement. You still have to focus on how do you, justify the rationale and the money behind the deal with shareholders. But on the other end of the spectrum are people that now have 200,000 different ways to engage with each other.
Yeah.
Right? And as a reporter, right, back in the day, you would go to the company. Now you can go to so many different stakeholders and meet them kind of where they are on different social platforms, right? And you can see it in a lot of these deals. Talent is probably the most important thing that you want to kind of grasp and deal with and keep. And headhunters immediately reach out. So you got to manage through all of these different platforms.
Marc, I want to ask a follow-up on this. Something I've observed quite a bit, when you're talking to a company that's in the middle of some sort of transaction, be it an IPO or M&A, the way they communicate often differs drastically depending on who their legal counsel is. So some attorneys are so buttoned up, they basically won't let you talk to the reporters at all. It's just a press release and a story, not even background. Am I right?
Well, I think different legal advisors probably have different ways that they handle all of this. And of course, if you make an announcement, right, until it closes, there are regulatory things that you have on the horizon, right? And you have to manage through all of this. But the reality on the ground, right, for everybody these days is that people tweet, right? They meet on Fishbowl, right? They have other platforms that they engage with, and we say what really has shifted in the communications, right? It used to be we broadcast the deal, and then you kind of manage through that until the close. And today you really have to engage with everybody, right? And consistently engage as a leader, and especially leaders have to be visible during that process, and they want to be visible, right? They want to make sure that they engage with the different stakeholders throughout the process, and that's always a fine line, right, between legal and communications.
That's interesting. That leads me to my next question. How do you make sure that the vision is shared by all the right people? I mean, if the CEO really believes in something, that's one thing, but it's important that other members of the management team, the board of directors, of course, and maybe other stakeholders too, right, share that vision?
Well, it's actually the data says that if you proactively share a vision, you have a 5 times higher success of having a successful deal outcome at the other end of the deal. And how do you do that? First of all, you have to, again, listen to your employees. The employees are the ones, right, that after the deal is done, right, and then you really go into execution, they are the ones that execute the deal, right? So they have to share that vision.
Right.
The other thing is, I think, boards, right? Bring the board along the journey as well, and not just the one PowerPoint example, right, where you kind of articulate the rationale of the deal, but really ongoing. What are you hearing? Today we have so many great listening tools, AI listening tools, and I think you can bring all of that in and then have a much more comprehensive way how you communicate around deals.
It makes a lot of sense. We already talked about social media, but is there anything else you'd want to add to that as far as what you advise clients in terms of, which platforms, for instance, should they be focused on? Maybe it depends on the company, right? Because some companies that have, I've come across this many times, you'll have a corporate following for a company, and then there's a consumer following if they're selling, baby food or something, right? And you might have a gazillion followers, right? So it must vary company to company is what I'm getting at.
It varies company to company, but also industry to industry, John, right? And one of the things that we try to capture when we talk to our clients is, what is the culture that you're meeting your stakeholders in, right? It's a difference if you have a gaming company, right? I'll give you an example. Activision Blizzard, that deal with Microsoft. They announced that deal actually on the Twitter page of the Xbox, right? Because they wanted to get folks excited about the deal, which was great, right? So you have to kind of like think through the industry. And of course, it's a little bit different between, a pharmaceutical company, a company in the gaming industry maybe, and a manufacturing company. So that cultural context plays a huge role at the end of the day if you're successful.
Gotcha. Now, we talked about employees as stakeholders before, but I'd like to drill into this a little bit more. Employees are incredibly important. They keep the company alive and functioning, right? So, tell me, we were just talking about how in the old days you could just have a message and it would get disseminated through television interviews, newspapers, and so on. I feel like with employees it's a little bit more complicated. Maybe it should be more two-way.
It's more two-way, definitely. I wanted to say engagement. Engagement is key, and listening is key, right? And that brings me to technology, right? Today, I think the exciting thing about the future, right? What does the future of communications and deal making really look like? We can actually look at AI as a tool to, exemplify different personas, if you want, right? So this sort of, I don't want to say template-y communications construct that we have, right? I think that will give way to much more, things that are really catered to the company in question and the employees in question too, because they are the ones at the end of the day, right? After the deal is before the deal, right? The close happens, and then you actually have to execute on all the promises that you made during that time. And you want to make sure that you engage with folks along the journey so that broader vision, right? What is the company going to achieve long term? that everybody's really on board executing that. I'll give you another example of that. Brad Jacobs, right, who is the head of QXO, he just went through a deal with Beacon, the roofing company, right?
Yeah.
And he has a wonderful tool where after the close, the first thing he does as part of his playbook, he asks employees, what's the one thing that we can do better, right, in the future? And that energizes folks, right? That's why you do these deals, right? To come up with new, innovative ways. And if you bake that into this larger vision, that reaps benefits for you.
On this topic, I want to ask you one more question. I remember several years ago there was an Alcoa split, so the company broke into two different parts. I happened to meet a steel worker, and I got to tell you, Mark, he was terrified. He was very worried about his job, and that tells me that Alcoa could have done a better job explaining what, the rationale for that. Is that fair, particularly in a situation like that where the company's being broken apart? It stands to reason some employees are going to get distressed, right?
Yeah, I think the stress and the anxiety is real. And hence, we're coming back to the first point, right? Listening and really taking that seriously and engaging, if you have a cross-border deal also, right? Oftentimes, going into different regions of the world, there are workers' councils, there are different relationships between executive teams and employees. You really have to think through that. But the opportunity is always to engage and not just broadcast and let it sit there and meander.
Gotcha. I want to ask you if you can give me a couple of examples of success stories where not a split up, but the opposite, a merger, where you've got two companies with very different cultures. How do you work that out? I mean, in theory, the merger can look great, but at the end of the day, if the people don't get along well, you're going to have real problems, right?
Yeah, we talked about Activision Blizzard. Yeah. It's an interesting one. I think Reckitt and Mead Johnson is another one where the CEO, I don't want to misspell his name and mispronounce it, but he did a great job at using LinkedIn, for example, as a platform for his vision, and then brought everybody and corralled people around that combined vision. So these are good examples. There are great examples, right, of mergers that have really created tons of value. You know the stories about YouTube, which was bought by Google back in the day before it was Alphabet. These are great, of course, success stories, but always anchored in sort of a common culture and common goal and vision.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you, if you've got different stakeholders who care about different things, does that mean you need to have multiple forms of communication? So maybe this is obvious. You should have a communication to your employees, right? But do you need to have a handful of different types of communication, and how similar should they look?
Yeah, absolutely. So today we talk about the multi-stakeholder world, of course, right? And you want to engage these folks really where they are, right? The platforms that really resonate with them. So, for a client that could look a little bit different, right, than for an employee and for a shareholder, right? Of course, you have a sort of common thread in the vision, but using these different channels is a great opportunity. And I think today we have actually more platforms really than ever before. Also to tell your own stories, right? From podcasts, right, to visual content, to video content. But you got to do it, and you got to do it consistently, and that's always a challenge, right? Because you have to execute that with different folks, probably not. Everybody has time at the same. So
makes sense. Last question for you, Mark. Do you have any predictions about what sorts of practices might become standard practice looking ahead in light of all these considerations we've just discussed? I mean, I think communication has to change, doesn't it?
Communication has to change. We talked about human centricity. We talked about the fact that you want to be engaging your audiences. And I think AI will actually be a great tool in the future. On the one side, listening. On the other side, you can really build personas, John, right, today, that you couldn't, right? Back in the day, you had to go into the field and do sort of like perception studies, right? Today, you can almost model with your AI tools, what does the analyst think versus what does my customer think versus any other stakeholder. And you can almost like red team and anticipate, right? What are the reactions? And at the end of the day, right, that's the cultural element that you want to sort of want, as an umbrella, how do I want to make my audiences feel as part of that journey?
That's really interesting stuff, Marc. Well, we're gonna leave it there. Marc, it's been a pleasure to see you again.
Great to see you again, John.
Hope to have you back soon. I'm John Jannarone, Editor-in-Chief of CorpGov, signing off from Nasdaq MarketSite.